Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar with Ayming and Jefferson Wells. We will start in a couple of minutes so that we are sure that everyone who subscribed can join. So feel free to go grab a cup of coffee or a sandwich if you want to eat during the presentation. We'll be hosting this with Stefan Hevert, who's already present. Hi, Stefan.
Hello.
And we'll be starting in a couple of minutes. And we'll get hydrated with Stefan in between. So do not hesitate as we will start in a couple of minutes. Just notice that on the right side, you have a chat that's at your disposal. You can use it to ask any questions during the presentation. I will be your moderator today, and I'll do my best to ensure that we have all questions answered by Stefan and his expertise. I see that some people are still joining, so a couple of more minutes waiting, and then we'll be able to start. Just some more patience. Maybe I'll be able to test the chat to see that everyone is present. Can everyone read what's written in the chat? Okay. Thank you, Julien. Thank you, Thomas. So we have most people. See that we have a new joiner. So for the one who newly joined, we'll wait a couple of minutes. Let's say that we'll start at 12:35. So we ensure that some people are still in the queue to grab a sandwich before joining the webinar. We'll be able to connect and won't be missing anything. Stefan, I hope you already ate something.
No, not yet. It's been busy, but it's okay.
Okay. Just one more minute and we'll be starting. All right, Stefan, if you're ready, I propose that we start and that we give more information about how to unlock and secure R&D financial web, our topic of today.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's get started. So today I'll be your moderator and hosting the webinar. As much more expertise than I have, I will just be here to support him and leave him for most of the time the words. So Stefan, let you introduce yourself.
Yes, well, thanks for having me, Mathieu. So my name is Stefan Hevert, and within Ayming Benelux, I'm in charge of the innovation performance department. So I lead the consultants who help companies access finance and finance their innovations and R&D projects.
Thank you. And I'm head of Jefferson Wells, part of Manpower Group Belgium. We are a consulting firm specialized in life science engineering, HR, and finance. And I wanted with this webinar to show expertise and also give heads up about our collaboration with Ayming and how to help us secure those leverage. What are we going to talk about today?
So we'll look at the R&D financial levels just in a broader context. So I'll give an introduction, a little bit of the context. I think it's important to be to see where it all comes from and why those specific pillars and incentives were chosen, and then we'll go a little bit more into details on the what we consider to be the most prominent ones in Belgium and the pitfalls, the do and don'ts, and hopefully have some interaction and some questions by the broader audience.
Perfect. Let's move forward.
Yes.
Uh, a word to start and introduce Jefferson Wells. Jefferson Wells is present for 20 years in Belgium. In the past, it was under the name Experis. We are the newest brand within Manpower Group. As I mentioned, 4 areas of expertise: engineering, life science, finance, and HR. With 39 sales and recruitment staff at your service, but also 150 consultants working for our customer. We are proud to say that we are EcoVadis Gold Star rated since 2017, as CSR is something important to us. And to give you an idea about the size, because we're not always well known on the market, we have built more than 345,000 hours last year to our customers. But also, seeing the war for talent, I thought it was important to mention that in 2020, even with COVID, we have reached interviews with more than 3,200 people in Belgium and abroad. Stefan, I think you have the same at Ayming. We need to go abroad and look for more than just Belgian profiles. We need to go look for the most competent profile working for us. One partner with 4 services. I mentioned 150. It's reached to 200 while taking HR and finance with it. Sorry. We have completed for our customers all consulting, permanent, temp at the same time, more than 263 recruitment processes last year. We have a huge database today with more than 18,000 profiles that are relevant to one of our 4 activities. And each month we screen more than 250 candidates. This is for a couple of figures, but the 4 services we can propose you is as well consulting, interim, project-based, or simple recruitment and selection processes. These are the 4 services that Jefferson Wells can provide you.
All right, so let me quickly introduce Ayming. Ayming is an international consulting group which originated in France, but in the meantime, we are present in 15 countries. We've been doing this for over 30 years. I think worldwide, we have about 1,300 experts. And in 2020, we achieved about 137 million euros of revenue. In the Benelux, we've been present for 18 years. So far, we have grown to 45 experts and people. I think important, if you look at what we've doing, we managed about 8,000 plus R&D projects, or at least 8,000 plus, and have audited 800,000 plus payslips or payroll info. We've also been partnering with some of the main organizations in our country, like a BioWin, like a Flanders Bio, like VOCA. And if you look at our client portfolio here in the Benelux, it's a very accurate representation sample of what's been going on, of the major players, but also of startups and scale-ups. That's okay. So let's have a look first at the landscape, the general landscape of R&D incentives, and especially how Belgium fits in to that. And to introduce that, I think it's good that we take a step back to the Lisbon European Council in the year 2000, where one of the main findings was that innovation would be and will be a key driver for the long-term growth of a knowledge economy, which is the case for Europe. So innovation as something that will be crucial for the existence of Europe, the future competitiveness of Europe with respect to the US and, of course, China. R&D is a major structural part of the innovation process. It is also a part of the process which is enormously risky and costly. So one of the insights from that council, one of the decisions, was that we need to help finance that and help mitigate part of innovation. Um, with that in mind, the European Council very clearly set a numerical goal to be achieved by the member states, and it was that the gross domestic expenditure on R&D, as expressed of a percentage of GDP, had to reach a certain level. In this case, it was put at 3%. Originally, the member states were supposed to achieve that by 2010, but it's only been in recent years that overall, averaged out over the European Union, that we came near that threshold of 3%. So the general idea is that if the initiatives based on that pillar, that innovation is a key driver for long-term growth, that if the initiatives are efficient and that if the initiatives are being implemented by the member states well, is that each member state should be able to achieve about 3% GERD. Again, why the focus on financing or helping finance the R&D part of the innovation process? Well, if you look at it, it is the most costly part. It is a part that is enormously risky. The transfer from a concept and from pure theoretical knowledge to something that you can put on the market and valorize is what is commonly known as the value of debt. So within the different phases of that process, a lot of companies and a lot of startups fail. Um, Typically, they run out of money. That is one of the main causes of failure. Is that you do not get to the market before all your cash has been burned. And so that explains why one of the main results of that insight as innovation as a key driver for long-term growth was that the member states needed to implement several types of support for the R&D part of innovation. Now, there's a lot of those financial support mechanisms within the framework of this presentation. We do not have the time, of course, to go in detail. But if you look at it broadly, you can categorize them either as direct funding, typically non-dilutive, so not expressed as a part of equity, and that will be typically under the form of a grant. So a part of your project budget will be paid out by the grant by the local government, or it can be a loan. So for the duration of your project, for your R&D phase of your project, you will get a loan for under some very interesting conditions by the local government. So that's category number one. You have direct funding, typically non-dilutive, or you have an indirect funding, in essence, that you will pay less taxes if you meet certain criteria. So either you get cash or you have to pay less taxes with anything or with any costs associated with the R&D phase in your project, depending on what type of project, depending on where you are with your project in the maturity of your ID. All right, so based on that, Belgium, as the other member states, have implemented or made choices um, to define different support mechanisms depending on the maturity of your ID. So the technology readiness level, or TRL, so how close you are to a product or a service that you can put on the market. If we take a view at what happens at the different levels, because of course Belgium with its quite complex structure, at federal level you will have typically every fiscal incentive that is linked to paying less taxes. The prime examples are, for example, the wage withholding tax for R&D projects, the innovation income deduction. Others are prime d'innovation, the Bel SME regime. In this presentation, we'll go into the top two, so the wage withholding tax and the IID, because those are the most prevalent ones, are well, as we will see from the numbers later on, the most commonly used ones. At the Brussels level, you have support mechanisms for example, applied PhD grants. So grants meant to support young researchers doing a PhD within the context of research for a company, so relevant for a company, or you can have support mechanism or subsidies for spin-off projects and R&D projects. So these are some of the common ones, the most typically and commonly used ones. In the region of Flanders, you have subsidies for projects depending on whether it's onderzoek, so whether it's still research at a very early TRL, or if you are closer towards the market, if you're approaching TRL 4 to 7, which is then called the development project, an ontwikkelingsproject. Very interesting. There's also support mechanism for, again, supporting young researchers doing their PhD in collaboration, in close collaboration with the private sector. So projects that are relevant and are of course of strategic importance for the companies. And then finally, you have the similarly in the Walloon region, support mechanisms, grants for research very early on in the technology readiness level, so industrial research, or closer by to the marketable product, commercial end product or service, experimental development grants. Again, here also we see that there's quite a support, that there's a support mechanism dedicated to helping young researchers within companies. So researchers, young researchers who are doing a PhD project for a project that is relevant and of importance for the private sector. If you look at where we have gotten so far since that fateful council in 2000, we can see that in recent research published by BELSMO, so the Belgian Scientific Policy Office, we see that Belgium has surpassed that 3% threshold in 2019. And it's the first year that we finally reached that threshold of 3% GERD. Which is very good, actually, if you compare it to the rest of the member states. So according to Eurostats, that's the average is about 2.89%. So if you look at the average, Europe is still not there at that 3%. So that's very good. So overall, we score better. We surpassed the 3%, and we are ahead of, or at least at the top of the class. And that's also been confirmed by a recent publication, which is the European Innovation Scoreboard of 2021, where we can see that Belgium is ranked number 4 behind, of course, the standard Nordic countries, which historically have been and are still very strong in innovation. All right. So that's overall. Now, we've known that in 2019, we've been hit with the global health crisis of COVID-19. So it's interesting to see how companies have reacted to that, especially when it comes to investments in research and development and in innovation. What we have also seen is that following the COVID-19 crisis, we also saw a huge increase in audits, in tax controls by the federal government. We will go a little more into details on how to prepare for that. But in any case, what we saw is a very vigorous and strict formalism with respect to that. So a very heavy emphasis on respecting to the letter of the law the implementation of those fiscal incentives, sometimes even too rigorous, but we can hopefully have a discussion on that later. And of course, a huge war for talent, as Mathieu initially already discussed. And I think that this is the part where I think Mathieu wants to share some of his insights and experience, again, as his function at Jefferson Wells.
Absolutely, thank you, Stefan. Because it's nice to have incentives and that the government is creating incentives to improve the situation. But if a company wants to invest X% in R&D, they still have to find the right profiles to execute the research and development tasks. And we are doing at Manpower Group lots of surveys around this, and I have to say that since the COVID, we've seen figures we haven't seen in a long time, or sometimes that we never saw. For instance, the confidence of the candidate in the labor market is lower than we have ever saw in one of our survey, and it's 20 years that we're doing that survey about the confidence of the candidate in the market. It's even lower than the financial crisis of 2008. That's just to give a barometer. And some may think, okay, you know, the war for talent, it's been ages that we're talking about that. And yes, indeed, we talk about that for ages in engineering. For instance, we know that in engineering, there are about 1,000 young engineers coming out of the school each year in Belgium. Well, actually, the need of the market would be around 1,500, which creates still a huge gap to cover. But recently, we also did try to position ourselves on other profiles and on other markets where we saw that, for instance, we all know and we all heard about electrical vehicles, which is a great boom. And we see more and more loading station everywhere and incentives installing for companies loading stations. But what if I told you that even the people who just have no graduation and just a technical expertise in electricity, even that profiles are missing on the market. So it's really on each and every single layer on the labor market in Belgium that you are remarking that war for talent. We've seen companies investing a lot in their HR department to attract the right profiles, and even though the candidates are more than ever kings and queens on the market. So my advice is that it's nice to have R&D policy, but ensure that you also have the right HR policy to attract the right profile to execute what your plans are for research and development. These are a couple of figures to highlight what I just mentioned, because even if the candidates are not really faithful in the market, we see that 50% of the companies are planning to hire. And that was last survey we did for the fourth quarter this year. It's huge. I mean, it's figures that we almost never saw. And we see that talent shortage is a high peak in all three regions of Belgium, in Flanders, in Wallonia, and in Brussels. I said about 80%, but you see here it's 77. Here, the 80% is sorry for the candidates who are not trusting the market for the moment, but also 77% of the employers in Belgium cannot find the skills that they need. And we're talking about skills. It's a second consecutive quarter where we have such high figures. And this is, again, not only for engineers or technical profile, it's also valid for a bookkeeper, for HR profiles, for all kinds of profiles that we can have. And that's maybe the link back to you, Stefan, is what can Belgian companies offer to incentivize people to join? And there, what we can see is that we have lots of companies trying to find IDs where we can see that, and that's again the link that we have with Ayming, is that 30% of the companies are increasing wages, but 15% are also offering new incentives, joining bonuses and so on. And that's back the link to you, part of the presentation, Stefan.
Yes, thank you, Mathieu. So I think it's interesting then to see what are the possibility for the Belgian companies to, let's say, have financial help with the R&D part of their innovation projects. And if you look at what is possible in Belgium, you will see that it is typically that all fiscal incentives and all types of financial support mechanisms for innovation will be typically focused on four domains. So it will be either people, so that means financial help with the payroll costs associated with an innovation project, with an R&D project, because as we know, highly educated people, especially in Belgium, are very expensive. There's an increase in wages, so that means that the R&D project, which is risky in itself already, will typically also have highly educated people, so very expensive people. The second domain on which the fiscal incentives in Belgium will focus is the investments in assets which are in a lot of projects required to make not only the project feasible, but also later on everything necessary for going to the market, for having a economically viable product or service. There are a number of mechanisms or ways in which a company can look for financial support from the government. There will be support for the creation of intellectual property. So suppose that you have an innovation project that results in something that will give the company a competitive advantage, which it can claim as being intellectual property. Then the Belgian government wants to support you in having made that investment, in having taken that risk, and will allow you to use that to pay less taxes. And then finally, also the creative part on anything that, of course, is linked with innovation also has a creative part. Also, there, the Belgian government has put into place some measures that allow you to protect actually that creativity, the creative part of your project. Now, if you brief, so go ahead, Mathieu.
Yeah, and just that we wanted to test, Stefan, at this moment a poll.
Mhm.
So I hope it's gonna work. Do you see in the questions, in the polls side, do you see the question coming in? Does everyone sees it in his chat box on the right side? On- yeah, perfect. So let's take a minute just to have a look at what we propose. So we just gathering the four dimensions that Stefan explained us. If everyone could just mention what he or she is already using in his company. So we just have to click and then on submit vote. And I see that we have some vote at the moment, or the most of the response. So Stefan, I don't know if you see the answers.
Yes, I do. So the results are quite in line with what we see also within our portfolio, within our clients. So for the most part, people have at least heard of the wage withholding tax, the withholding tax partial exemption for researcher, which is also broadly known as the most popular, or let's say the most known one. We will also see that later on the figures in the slides, because it's also the part that's been, from a financial point of view, taking the biggest part in the budget by the Belgian government. Um, I am a bit surprised by the authors' rights regime that a lot of people know about it, but that's a good thing. Although, as we will see later also on, companies who have been using it or who are planning to use it should be aware that there's most likely an incoming wave of fiscal inspections linked to that. And then it's a bit surprising that anything with innovation income deduction and enhanced tax deduction for the capex is a bit less known, although it's still very interesting.
Mhm.
But in this case, it's mostly about the two main known are the ones linked to the payroll of the people, which is the biggest, typically the biggest cost center for projects in Belgium.
So this was to see what you've heard of, and let's put the same poll to see what you are using in the companies. We take a moment to let you answers. Okay, Stefan, any comment on the results you see now?
Yes. So again, as number one, which incentive is the one that's being used the most? Is the wage withholding tax, the partial exemption for researchers? So that makes sense. That's also very much aligned with what we see, what is also known. We now see that there's quite a number also using the innovation income deduction. A bit surprising given that uh, the, the 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 previous poll mentioned that it wasn't that well known. Um, so happy to see that it's been used quite a bit. We do have to see on in which way, because it is a little bit more complex as a fiscal incentive, as with respect to criteria, expectations, and let's say documentation that is required.
Okay, perfect. Thank you everyone for your participation. Just to mention also, because I didn't mention earlier, this webinar is being registered and you'll get the link by email after. I think it will be tomorrow or Monday at the latest. So you can review and eventually deep dive into one of the topic that we would have gone too fast or too quickly about with Stefan. Stefan, I'll leave you the word.
Thank you. So after this, I think it's useful to have a little closer look at the fiscal incentives that we mentioned, and the first one, of course, is the most well-known one. Is so if we look at the maturity, it was already introduced quite a while ago, and it has been under its current form introduced for private companies in 2005. Our own survey within a portfolio of our clients says that about 7 out of 10 companies who have innovation roadmaps apply it. So it's quite well known, it's quite well established. And if you look at how it's been budgeted these days, you see that the Belgian government has about 1 billion euros that it allocates to the use of this fiscal incentive. We also see that over the years since it has been introduced, that the generosity has been improved or at least has increased. So, the for a same number of researchers, the a company now can benefit more than when it was first introduced. Uh, Important to know that if you weren't aware of this measure, there is, under certain criteria, the possibility to go back into the past and have a look at what you might have missed and claim that if you have legitimate projects and researchers that can that fall under the criteria. You also have to be very aware that it has been subject to tax controls every year. So about 25 to 30% on average of all companies who use it will get a fiscal audit by the government. And what we have seen in recent years is that the way those have been conducted have become very stringent on formalism, on having the exact letter of the law being applied. So we'll go into details on some tips and tricks and things to watch out later. But be forewarned, if you have not applied it and you're planning to do so, that you should also prepare with a tax control in mind. So, what are the main criteria to be eligible for this, and what does it pertain? In essence, the fiscal incentive is proportional, or the financial gain is proportional to the amount of researchers that work on a research project or R&D projects. And so there's already 3 main elements in that we can hear. First, it is about researchers and about R&D projects and the time that they are working on it. For each of those parts, there's a specific definition. So a researcher, according to this, is someone who is on the payroll. So it's important that even though external people, independent people can also do research and development, that they are not eligible under this fiscal incentive. They need to be the holder of a specific diploma. So only masters and bachelors in STEM are eligible. Unfortunately, the decision by the, or in my opinion, unfortunately, the decision by the Belgian government was taken to put in place a rule that excludes people who can also do R&D activities, but who then have a diploma in economics, in psychology, you name it, anything outside of the more conventional STEM areas. Uh, at the other part of the definition, it's about R&D projects. So there's very definitive, or definition. Also definition. It's based on what has been defined at European level as an R&D project. Typically, we complement the existing definition of what is an R&D project, as stated in the law, with the Frascati manual, which is a consensus at OECD level within scientists at the OECD level on what is an R&D project, what constitutes an R&D activity. And so important is that the financial benefit that is proportional to the amount of time those researchers work on R&D projects. So you will have to make a calculation, and you will have to be able to document that time allocated to R&D projects. Important is that besides the government and the, let's say, the finance department of the government, there is also another government actor in play, which is BELSPO. We mentioned it earlier before. It's a Belgian Science Policy Office, and they are the guardians of all companies that want to apply this. So every company that has the ambition of using this should be notified on a specific portal that's been maintained by BELSPO. Well, we don't have to go into detail in the calculations, but specifically there is a calculation at individual level. So based on the wage withholding tax that is being paid by the, or should be paid by the company for all the researchers. So again, a researcher is someone on payroll with an eligible diploma. But there are also specificities with respect to the differences in diploma. So you will have to make a calculation based on who has a master's diploma, who has a bachelor's diploma, and implement some additional checks and balances in those calculations. I mentioned earlier that you can go and look into the past if you weren't aware of this, and if you want to see if you would be eligible back then. You can go up until 5 fiscal years back, but do aware that you still have to meet all criteria. And in most cases, the difficulty is, of course, the notification at the BELSPO database. And again, taking into account that if you have to go back for 5 years, you still have to go back and find all the diplomas, all the R&D projects, all the documentation that are required. So just because you go back into the past does not mean you do not have to meet all the other criteria. Overall, if you take of a highly educated master, so someone with an engineering degree or a master's in physics or chemistry, you name it, with a decent amount of experience, and you look at what it would mean if this person would do 100% of his or her time on an R&D project, you can see that you can reduce your costs of about 20% if you apply this correctly and if you meet all criteria. So it's quite an interesting incentive for Belgian employers with a Belgian payroll, given that, again, the payroll costs in Belgium for highly educated employers are quite high. So the results of the poll, where it showed that this was the most well-known one and was also the most applied one, makes sense given the way it financially benefits companies. I mentioned that Belgium, contrary with its neighbors, has decided to implement a specific criterion on diplomas. I won't go into details because there's a large list of it, but in essence, your diploma has to be a master bachelor's in STEM. So again, if there's a doubt here, you can go and ask for a binding advice at BELSPO. We will tell you, okay, whether this is eligible under this fiscal incentive. At the moment, so if you would like to go back in this year, you could go back to the year 2017. Do keep in mind that the deadline for claiming anything back until the year 2017 is the end of this year. So make sure that if you want to do that, that not only do you check if you meet all criteria, build your file, and then submit it before the end of this year. If you miss that deadline, that means that as of 2022, you can only go and look back at 2018. But then I think it's time maybe for a testimonial, because Jefferson Wells, you've been applying this yourself with the help of Ayming.
Absolutely, and I wanted also to share that, because sometimes you could just think that it's lots of work to implement that and lots of admin to go through. But I have to say that you facilitate tremendously our life at Jefferson Wells by just putting a couple of very pragmatic actions in place. So we know what we have to provide you. That's the information you just mentioned. What's the mission? What are the diplomas? What's the content of the mission? What's the resume of the candidate? And then we just keep informing you, okay, is the person still in the same mission? Because we remain a consulting firm, can move quite easily. But thanks to the tool you've put it in place, yeah, 5 minutes admin every quarter, I think, and we're always up to date. And you are able with that 5 minutes admin of us, you are able to do properly and efficiently your work. Um, so even with the fast-paced environment, this process allows us to be very flexible. We send you the detail, and as mentioned, there's also no rush. Of course, we try not to wait 2 years before implementing something, but we know that when we have someone starting, well, it doesn't have to be solved in 2 days and analyzed in 2 days. We still have some time because we won't lose any of the incentive. And once you validate the content, well, we just had the follow-up to do. And when our consultant are starting a new mission, well, we just start the new process again, mention, okay, it's a new mission, here is the detail, and you advise us on what we can optimize or not. But also, it's a positive impact to our customers because when we used to work with Ayming as we are doing I mean, Ayming was already a provider before I started 5 years ago within Jefferson Wells. Well, thanks to you coaching, we've been able to identify it in the highlights. So sometimes we have doubt, is it that person or that person optimization we can do? But we know then that we can also optimize that for customers and that they also take benefits of those rules and tax regimes so that they also have more attractive pricing. So this is a very positive impact and for Ayming and for us and for final customers. And not a lot of people are involved. It's our own business team, so the people leading the consultant. We have one single point of contact at Ayming handling us as customer, and then we have our own variant comp and ben, where there's also an automation where once the discussion has been made between our single point of contact and the business, there's one template to be filled and be sent by comp and ben, and then we implement that properly with the right taxation, and we know that we are safe and secure should we be one of the lucky number of the control tsunami, to see it in a positive way.
Okay, well, thank you for this, Moon. Happy to hear you're happy with the work we've been doing together and set in
Absolutely.
place. You mentioned fiscal controls. I think we saw in a recent wave of fiscal controls some questions that have been recurring, that have emerged as being the most commonly asked ones. Typically, there's a debate on what constitutes R&D under the law. As defined for this fiscal incentive, because it's quite broadly defined. So what we typically will do is then invoke other sources of what can be seen as legitimate definitions of R&D. I mentioned Frascati, which is a body of work that is the result of a large-scale survey with the scientists within the OECD, and which has been updated every couple of years. So can be seen as a very legitimate source of what constitutes R&D. We also look at the legal text from neighboring countries, because such as the French CIR, such as the Dutch WBSO, because those also are the result of that the council and that strategy set in place 20 years or over 20 years ago. So we invoke quite a lot of different sources which we see as legitimate alternatives and complementary to the Belgian definition of R&D. Typical questions we also get is, well, we get inspected by the FOD Financier, the SPF Finance. What's the authority or what's the role of Belspo as a government actor in this? So very important is that Belspo has the legal authority to give binding advices on both the R&D character of a project and on the eligibility of a certain diploma, because again, Belgium quite arbitrarily decided to implement a criterion for the diploma. So I'm not going to go into all those frequently asked questions. I'll just take the most pressing ones. For diplomas, is a copy of the diploma the only accepted proof? No, but it is the best proof, of course. Any certificate on whether a person has an official certificate with a stamp from the university or the college where that person studied is also valid. But of course, a full copy of the diploma is better. Diplomas from outside the EU are also accepted, but be aware that then in an equivalent certificate of NARIC can be asked by the government. Other more frequently asked questions is, can you apply to the managing director? Yes, if he or she is on the payroll, of course, and if you can, still um, demonstrate or argue that that person has to follow directives from, for example, a board of directors. And then finally, quite often asked question is, can the pro rata can be 100%? So can you apply, can you assume or argue that a manager or someone in a management position does 100% of his or her time on R&D? Yes, again, the level of inquiry, of course, by the inspector will be higher for these kind of cases. But if you document it with the same level of documentation, which we can help you set up, then there shouldn't be any legal constraint on not applying 100% for management positions. When it comes to how do I deal with classified information on my R&D projects? That is, you can agree with with the government, with the inspector to show some of those documents on site, but you are not obliged to necessarily share them, and therefore distance yourself from the application. So the fact that you cannot immediately send them, but only show them at your office, at your premises, does not negate your application automatically of this fiscal incentive. Um, Also important for many of the more financial responsible people, financial or the people who are end responsible for the finances linked to this. Should I pay corporate taxes on the wage withholding tax? Well, don't forget that it should be from an accounting point of view booked as an exploitation subsidy, and so it's part of your P&L. So in the end, it will impact, of course, your EBIT. So in the end, it impacts your taxes. If we look at the second fiscal incentive, so the innovation income deduction, so which was also shown in the poll as being the second most used one. So we saw that since it has been introduced in 2008, it has been broadened in scope. So where originally it was only meant to be valorized for income linked to patents, most recently it was now allowed to be applied for different types of intellectual property. We see that in most recently available figures, about 634 million euros were allocated or were used by companies to have a financial advantage of intellectual property they created during their innovation projects. If we look at the essence of what it means, it is that if you have created intellectual property from which you now as a company are getting revenues, well, if all those revenues linked to that innovation, to the result of the innovation project, i.e. intellectual property, you can use partially to lower your taxable basis and thus pay less corporate taxes. If you're unsure about your calculation model, there is an additional step which you can take, that is to present your calculation model to the ruling commission in order to have an official approval of the calculation method. So I mentioned that it's no longer restricted to patents, but to different types of intellectual property. So you can now also apply to revenue linked to copyrighted software, to plant variety rights, and to orphaned medicines. So these types of intellectual property which have been or which are the result of an R&D project, with the definition of R&D being the same as mentioned previously for the wage withholding tax exemption. Well, those intellectual properties, those revenues can be used partially to lower your taxable basis for your corporate tax. Interesting enough is that you do not only have to be the owner, or that's not solely for owners of IP, but also under certain criteria for the user of the intellectual property. What is important is that this was meant to, let's say, reward companies which have made that leap and which have made that investment into an R&D project and into an innovation project, which is, as we saw, risky and quite costly. So that does also mean that the revenues linked to that will be subject to a ratio called the Nexus Ratio, which represents how much of the efforts, the costs and investments that were necessary to create that intellectual property were also made by the company itself and not by necessarily third parties. So it is really meant to keep the to reward Belgian entities with the investments and efforts and the risk taking of going on such a trajectory. Once you've identified that, so you have identified the net income linked to your intellectual property, subject to an additional Nexus Ratio, you can use 85% of that to lower your taxable basis, so you pay less corporate taxes. Typically, we recommend that you present the calculation method and let all the lists of costs and expenditures linked to your project. You present that to the advisors of the ruling commissions just to be sure to have an official validation of that calculation method. And we typically recommend that you do that before in the first quarter following the fiscal year in which you want to start applying this, so that you still have time to have a discussion with the ruling commission and to implement it in your declaration for your corporate taxes later on in the year. Typically that's around the summer or September. So there's different scenarios, different types. I won't go into details, but you will have to be able to isolate the part of your intellectual property, of the revenues that are linked to your intellectual property, depending on whether it's a licensing, royalty, you name it, and you will have to be able to um, in a very detailed way build the profit and loss statement that is linked to the creation of that intellectual property. And so all of that you can discuss with the advisors of the ruling commission who see a lot of cases in different sectors, who are also very aware of typical margins, typical costs, and so who will be able to challenge you on that. The next fiscal incentive is the R&D investments or the enhanced tax deduction or tax credits for capital expenditures. So the investments a company makes into assets. It's been introduced quite a while ago, so in 1999. And if you look at the budget, surprisingly, it has been used quite a lot. It has been even used in 2017, at least, more than the innovation income deductions. The overall idea is that if the investment into an asset is eligible, is that you can use part of that, part of the initial investment or part of the depreciation value to reduce your corporate taxes. Very importantly here, there's no retroactivity. So if you miss something, that's unfortunate for the company, but you will have to move forward and look ahead.
Stefan, just a short intervention to mention that we still have 7 minutes to the original timing, and let's hope that we'll still have some time for question. I just checked in the chat, and there's no question coming in for the moment, but so that you have an idea of the timing.
Super. All right. Thank you very much. So I will keep it brief in that case. So I mentioned it has to be an investment into an asset. Typically, it will be either into an asset that helps you reduce your carbon footprint, makes you more environmentally friendly, an asset for investment for R&D, necessary for R&D, or it helps you save energy. Very briefly, you can either use the initial investment, the initial total investment amount to lower your taxable basis, or you can use part of your depreciation amount linked to that investment to also lower your taxable basis for the economic or the accounting lifetime of that asset. And then finally, the author's rights. It was introduced also quite a while ago. Important that is that if an employee creates intellectual property, for example, a programmer on payroll of a company creates software, then that can be seen as intellectual property for that employee, and in mutual agreement between employee and employer, it can be decided that part of the salary of the employee can be paid in a different way than would be typical with the gross salary, making that more interesting for the employee. For the employer, there's no difference in payroll costs, in overall gross cost. But for the employee, it becomes more interesting because on that part that's being paid under a different regime than the standard gross salary, he or she pays less taxes. So he gets more net. He or she gets more netto income from a same gross salary. Um, Here it is very important to be aware that recently it has been announced that the government will look more closely at the application of this measure for uh, programmers. So because there has been signals that the IT companies and the independents in software development have been perhaps abusing this or taking this or applying this a little bit too aggressively. So be aware that as a result, there will most likely be in the coming 2 years a campaign of inspections for companies who or independents who have been applying this. Finally, so we discussed indirect incentives so far. We will have a close look or a look at the direct subsidies. The overall message that I want to give is that it is a complex landscape because there are possibilities at the regional level, so Walloon, Brussels region, Flemish region, but also at international level, whether that's just neighboring countries or the whole of Europe. And while the elements of submitting a file for all of these there are some common elements. In a lot of cases, there will also be some specificities to each of those programs. So what we see is that is a first challenge for companies is to find, okay, where do I best submit when it comes to cost benefit of this effort necessary to have a successful or a high success rate. Overall, what is very important is that the application must be introduced before the investments start, before the investments that are into your budget start. At Belgium level, there are programs independent of the region typically that are linked to, again, investments into assets, investment into environmentally friendly or improvements, investment into the training of the workforce or retraining of the workforce, and investment, of course, into research and development. Well, in the interest of time, I will keep it to this. The main message is it's not about just putting onto paper what you have in your head and what you want to do, but it's about positioning your project. So it's about iteratively positioning your project with respect to what exists, with respect to the holy trinity of performance, resource, and time, and to iteratively build your case and write it up in that way. I will briefly go over the key success factors and then I will close here. But the key success factors are your project has to be aligned with the region's strategic agenda because in the end you will be using taxpayers' money, and since typically the government will not get equity in the company, it will have to look at a return on investment in another way. That means can you argue and quantify the beneficial impact, hopefully, for the region if your project is successful. At the same time, since this is about R&D, which inherently has a high failure rate, can you also show that you have thought about risk mitigation and how you will deal with several different scenarios? Can you also show that if you work with a consortium, that each member has a specific added value, that the size has been kept to a realistic size, and that each member has been chosen is necessary but sufficient to address the different risks and challenges of the project? Of course, can you show that you've made your homework? Do you know the state of the art? Do you know the IP landscape? Do you have a freedom to operate? And all of that to be able to argue the resources that you are asking for, the resources that you plan on using, are they proportional to the challenges and the risks that you will be facing in that project? So the do's and don'ts, it's a summary of what I just told you, but again, make sure that you are able to tell a story because it's more than just putting onto paper science and technology. It's about being able to tell a story about a rationale. Keep it sharp. Just stick to what you want to do. Don't tell a fluffy and ambiguous story about it, and make sure that you show with a work program that is very well thought out, that you've thought about the risks, the challenges, and why you as a company with your peers are the best suited to tackle those challenges. And at the other hand, of course, don't rush it, don't overlook the default criteria, and yeah, make sure that you address also non-technical aspects, because it's not only about the science, technology, and the innovation part, but it's also about going to market and making sure that there are economic impacts for the region and for the grander body and the taxpayers, of course. So I will quickly skip this, but this is a summary of it. So I mentioned that we've seen a wave of fiscal inspections recently for the wage withholding tax. We've seen several companies struggle with it, unfortunately. So as a final tip, I would give you, if you've been applying or you plan on applying this, make sure to check that you've documented every aspect well, because we've seen an emphasis by the inspectors on formalism, the application by the letter of the law. Make sure that your notification at Belspo is in order, that the other actor within this setup has the necessary information. And of course, make sure now that you have timesheets, digital timesheets that show the clear link between a researcher and an R&D project. And if you have that, you have a high chance of passing. And if not, well, we are here to help you. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and I want to thank Jefferson Wells and especially Mathieu and Eric for helping setting this up and for having me.
Thank you, Stefan, for helping with all your sharing all your expertise. I didn't see any question coming in the chat, so I hope it's because we were crystal clear with the presentation. Still, I do have a question for you. Maybe it would inspire our audience asking also one or another question. Stefan, should I have my own company and I want to have a quick win, or I want to have a quick analysis? What is the best step to take?
So I would suggest then that you start, of course, with the most restrictive condition. And as you saw, that's most likely going to be the condition on having a specific diploma. Typically, you will be able to already filter out quite enough people, unfortunately, because of this criterion. And from there on, you can start looking at what these people have been working on, how you can document that. Typically, what is the process of documenting that? Do you have project management tools? Do you have timesheets that are linked to that? And then you can already see, okay, out of the majority of the work that's been done by these eligible people, what do I think I can defend or best aligns with the definition of R&D?
Okay, great. Thank you. I see that there's no question coming in the chat. So once again, thank you, Stefan. Thank you also the Ayming team who helped and all the people who helped building this webinar. We will be publishing this on our social media, so it will be on free access. And all the people who attended today will also receive a link to go immediately to the YouTube page to have a look at it. I see that someone is typing in the chat, so let's wait a second to see what the message is. Thank you, Thomas, for your friendly message. Congrats, we catch up with the timing. Thank you all for your attention, and let's hope to see you soon for another edition of one of our webinars, and who knows, maybe again with Ayming.
Thank you very much.